A Guten Erev Shabbos. Let me tell you a story from a book that I came across recently and reflect with you a little bit on the idea of what is left behind when we leave this world. In other words, the idea of a legacy. There was a guy, a Jewish fella, who died not quite 100 years ago. He passed away in 1924. He was young. He had just turned 41 at the time of his death. He lived with his parents a good part of his life, went to law school, got his degree, and worked writing reports and technical manuals for an insurance company. He never married. He was engaged a few times, but it never came to the chuppah. This fellow's name was Kafka, Franz Kafka, and in his spare time, he wrote short stories. He also tried to write a few novels, but he never finished them. He also thought about making Aliyah, but he never managed to leave Europe. He was a little strange, a little quiet, kept to himself and a small circle of friends. Before he died of tuberculosis, he left a note for his best friend Max. He told Max, "All the writings in my desk, I want you to burn them." Drafts of the few stories that he had published, sketches, fragments of stories for other works, chapters for those novels, diaries, letters to friends, family, fiancés, even a few Hebrew notebooks. As an adult, he was trying to learn the Hebrew language so that he could emigrate to Palestine. His dream there was to become a waiter in a cafe. Max did not follow his instructions, and when Franz died, Max went into his room with Franz's parents and emptied the entire contents of Franz's desk into a suitcase, which he took with him a few years later when he fled their native city of Prague in 1938. Max shipped his own writings. In his own lifetime, he published quite a bit, sent that in a shipment with his piano and his personal belongings on to Palestine. But he carried the suitcase with his friends' writings with him by hand out of Czechoslovakia over the border the day before it was annexed to the Third Reich. And he brought this suitcase with him to the land of Israel. Mourning the loss of so many friends who died in the Shoah, and as a result of it, Max wrote a biography of his friend Franz Kafka and published it, along with the novel fragments and the short stories and even shorter bits as small as a sentence or two or three. Ultimately, all the letters, all the diaries, even the sketchbooks with drawings and questions and ideas. It's really thanks to Max Brod that we have the entire body of literature of Franz Kafka, who holds a very special place in 20th century world literature. When Max died in 1968, his personal secretary, Ilse Esther Hoffe, took possession of that suitcase that still had unpublished manuscripts and works in it. She put some in safe deposit boxes, and some she kept under the bed in her apartment in Tel Aviv. She began selling postcards that Kafka wrote to Max, some letters, and some manuscripts on the European auction markets, which raised a number of hackles. Kafka, by this time, was a known phenomenon around the world, a literary celebrity, and her smuggling the documents out of Israel to Switzerland and selling them attracted a lot of negative attention towards her. The book I read, called Kafka's Last Trial, said that at one time there was a joke in Israel when at the airport, they ask you, did you pack your own bag? Some joker said, no, Esther Hoffe helped me, the one who smuggled out all these things. Selling Kafka's papers at auction stopped by court order, and the suitcase remained under her bed in her little apartment on Rehov Spinoza in Tel Aviv. She passed away in 2007, and her two daughters took possession of her apartment, including this suitcase of writings that had been spirited out of Prague almost more than a half a century before. In 2014, a court battle erupted in the Israeli Supreme Court when one of the two Hoffa daughters, now in advanced age, began soliciting offers from libraries and archives across Europe and around the world to buy Kafka's papers. The Israel Antiquities Authority and the National Library stopped the process, again by court order, and ownership of this trove of manuscripts became a three-way battle. On one side was Eva Hoffa, Esther's daughter, who claimed that her mother had inherited everything from her boss and presumed lover, Max. She, in turn, inherited from her mother. A second argument was made from the National Library of Israel, who claimed that Max had expressed several intentions to deposit Kafka's archive with them, as Kafka was such a major figure in Jewish literature. And the third argument was from an important literary archive in Germany, and claimed that since Kafka wrote entirely in German, his papers rightfully belong to the world of German literature and should be available to scholars in that field. And besides, they had the best archives, best resources for preserving and protecting these manuscripts. It's a great courtroom battle story and a fascinating result. Should I tell you what happened? You can read the book or we can talk about it. It's called Kafka's Last Trial, The Case of a Literary Legacy by Benjamin Ballant. The question is, what is a person's legacy and who gets to decide? You see from the story that the person who produced the writings had no say at all in what ultimately happened to them. He entrusted his best friend with the task of burning all his writings. That is what he wanted. It's what he said verbally and in writing. And that wish was completely ignored. By the way, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, gave exactly the same instructions to his followers, and they obeyed. They followed his wish. They burned everything. Of course, they made copies first. And out of that, I got to write a dissertation comparing him to Kafka. But that's for another time. Kafka expressed his wish, but ultimately, he did not get to control his legacy at all. In fact, he might be very uncomfortable, indeed, that his writings have been published at all, edited by Max, translated into dozens of languages around the world. Max took a great deal of control and by force of will turned his friend Kafka into a towering figure of modern literature. Kafka would be puzzled to see what had happened to his name and his writings, much of which he wasn't even happy enough to try publishing in his own lifetime. He would probably be mortified to learn that nowadays, he's a t-shirt and a coffee mug and a refrigerator magnet and a keychain. Max had the most say in making Kafka a globally known figure, which raises the question of editing. What did he leave out? What did he conceal? What did he alter? What did he preserve in order to protect the image he wanted of his friend? Are the leftovers, the cuttings, those unpublished writings of Kafka part of that legacy or not? In coming years, those of us who researched and read Kafka and tried to imagine what was going on in his head will have access to a new trove of data, things that he wrote that we never heard of before. How will that change things? Remains to be seen. And the presumed heirs, Esther and her daughters, one of whom passed away before this case came to trial, one after, they never met Kafka person to person. How can they claim to be his heirs? Their argument in court was, if someone inherits a Picasso, are they forbidden to sell it because they never met Picasso? There are other elements to the story also. All three of Kafka's siblings, 3 sisters, were all murdered in the Holocaust. But some of their children managed to escape, and they administer his estate from London. That's another piece to the puzzle. All of this story is to raise this question: what do we leave behind? And what has it become? Max Brod, the friend, published 83 books over the course of his career, and no one reads them, except the one he wrote about his friend Kafka. Kafka wanted to leave nothing, and in the process of that, became a major literary figure. Lord Jonathan Sacks, a great Torah teacher and Jewish leader of our age, died this week, and his passing touched many people, Jews and non-Jews, of all religious and political alliances. Rabbi, Dr., Professor, Lord Jonathan Sacks left us some 30 published books, and a collection of speeches, lectures, and a treasury of Divrei Torah, probably a good bit of which have yet to be published. Lord Sacks was in Toronto numerous times, and on a visit to Toronto in 2016, he touted the changes in British Jewry under his tenure as chief rabbi. He cited the notable, measurable uptick in the percentage of children enrolled in Jewish day schools in the UK. And he said that was one of Anglo Jewry's most significant accomplishments. He was certainly a minister to the Jews and enlightened us, challenged us, comforted us, and called on us to aim higher. He was there with us in difficult times and in good times. As a leader should, he cared for us and cared about us. He appreciated us as we were and never lost sight of what we could be. Even more, he articulated that vision in such a way that everyone could grasp it, even those, especially those who were not of his religious stripe, those who were, those who weren't. Still more, he was in a sense the chief rabbi of the Gentiles, as it were. Years ago, we read an insightful article that called him the chief rabbi of Canterbury, acknowledging the role that he had come to assume as spokesman for faith and the faith community in contemporary England. It was said about him this week by non-Jewish clergy and lay people alike. It was clear that his human expression of a very particularistic faith and practice resonated deeply in thoughtful people of many faiths. A good few years ago, I heard a story about Jonathan Sacks, which I found very enlightening. Let me share it with you. Balancing his commitment as an Orthodox Jew and his call to service to the larger world, Rabbi Sacks cherished his friendships with fellow clergy, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. When the Archbishop of the Catholic Diocese of Greater London passed away a number of years ago, a call came from the diocese asking Sacks to eulogize his dear friend at the funeral mass. Rabbi Sacks politely declined the honor, explaining that his faith prohibited him from entering a cathedral. Not quite hearing him or grasping what he was saying, the caller asked, "Well, if you don't want to speak, I understand, but would you please honor us with your presence? Just let us know and we'll reserve a place for you in the front pews with the other distinguished guests." Sacks again politely and calmly reiterated that his religion did not permit him to participate even by being present in the cathedral. This time the caller understood better and said, "May I call you back?" At some point later, the call came back. Would the good rabbi be permitted to attend via closed-circuit television from a location on the cathedral grounds, as long as it's not in the nave itself? Sacks said, "Yes, that I can do." So the funeral mass got underway, and as it started, the presiding bishop addressed the crowd. "Before we begin," I'm not going to do the accent, "before we begin," he said, "I should like to acknowledge the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, who joins us by closed-circuit television from the late Archbishop's offices. With her is the Chief Rabbi of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. It turns out that the Queen, as head of the Church of England, also has halachas, which govern the limits of her ecumenism." Can you imagine the conversation that went on in that office? There are stories of Lord Sacks, lectures, speeches, TED Talks. His writings are what will endure of his legacy. To my knowledge, there's no great dispute over the rights or the ownership of his written treasury. I'm sure between his foundation and his wife and children, they will continue to bring to light everything possible in terms of his wealth of insight and teaching and perspective. I'll just put in an advertisement for our own Jonathan Sacks Reading Circle, which relaunched last month in its 4th iteration in our Kehillah. We began reading Lord Sacks' book that was published this very year, titled Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times, truly what's needed at the moment. Our next meeting is this coming Monday, the 16th. In honor of Lord Sacks' memory, please join us if you can, whether you've read the book or not, and please do let me know if you'd like to present a chapter and lead our conversation with some questions at any point for any chapter in the book in the course of this year. A number of people have already signed up. Thank you very much. Rabbi Sacks' daughter gave a very moving and eloquent eulogy at the Levaya on Sunday. I hope you took or will take the opportunity to listen and be moved by her words. It's tempting to think of legacy in terms of children. For some, their children are their life's work and the legacy they bequeath to the world. For others, it's not. Some don't have children. They leave their mark in other ways. There's a synagogue in the center of Warsaw dedicated 120 years ago by Zalman and Rivka Nozick. They had no children. But that synagogue that they built and dedicated survived 2 world wars and 40 years of communism, and is in use today for daily minyanim and Torah learning and programs by the local Jewish community. Others have children who lead their lives in ways very different, very divergent than their parents would have hoped or even imagined for them. Children or buildings may or may not carry our names, carry our traditions, our memories, our values. They may very well all change, and such is the nature of life and time. The entire Kafka story I told you at the outset does not hinge on children. Kafka never married and never had any children. Max Brod married but never had any children. It was only the distant generations of people who never met, never interacted with the actual players who now fight the court battles over possession of the documents. I want to suggest that Lord Sax's legacy is of a markedly different character. There was a prominent and influential rabbi and Jewish leader named Shalom Dovber Schneerson, who was born 160 years ago last week, the same day on the Jewish calendar that would become Rav Sax's Yortzeit. He was a prolific author and systematic thinker and produced many original volumes of spiritual insight and exploration. When he was about to meet his end in this world, he told his followers, he said, "I am moving on, but I am leaving you the writings." His exact words were, "Ich gehe in Himmel, aber de Ksavim lazich eich." Let us certainly say the same for Lord Sax. He leaves us his writings, even though the man is no longer with us. And the legacy question is not who owns Lord Sax's writings. The question is who will read them, who will be changed by them, who will be guided and informed by them. Certainly in the weekly Parsha and the holidays, no less so in daily life, prayer, in our balancing our Jewishness with our responsibilities and privileges of being members, citizens of the larger world. The legacy question is not who has the claim on the writings, but the other way around. On whom will the writings exert a claim? Will people say, "I remain Rav Sax's student"? Will people say, "Jonathan Sachs writes something very interesting on this week's Parsha"? Will people say, "Although the political and social conditions try our patience, let me read you what Lord Sax wrote about the need for different groups in society to come together"? The real legacy is whoever the books claim, not who claims the books. If the books and the writings and the teachings exert a moral and intellectual and spiritual claim over us, then Rabbi Sax's legacy is perpetuated and ensured. We are not the heirs to the royalties from Lord Sax's writings. Rather, his teachings, his Torah, brings out the royalty in us. It can be no coincidence that this week has been the week of Chayei Sarah, the Parsha which is titled The Life of Sarah. It's always shocking, and this year how much more so, that the portion titled The Life of Sarah tells us in its second verse that Sarah died. What kind of cruel joke is that? Last week's Parsha, let that be called The Life of Sarah, or call this week's Parsha The Death of Sarah. What kind of bitter irony is this? Fact is that the life of Sarah is and remains how she influenced those who followed in her ways, even, especially after her passing. The Parsha describes the story of her family, Yitzchak, and his shidduch, his marriage with Rivka, which perpetuated the Jewish people, not only physically, but spiritually. Yitzchak had a traumatic youth, to be sure, bullied by his half-brother Yishmael, taken to Mount Moriah by his father Avraham, and yet he developed into a quiet, dedicated Jew, author of the Mincha prayer, digger of wells to bring water to the surface, and remained in the land of Israel his entire life. At the end of this week's Parsha, Avraham dies too, teaching us that this is the way of all flesh. Even our great leaders, our teachers, our parent figures grow, flourish, then decline and pass away. The legacy is in those of us who make ourselves accountable to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, who allow their Torah to infuse and inform our lives every day, every moment. Then we'll live up to the blessing in Shemos, in Exodus, in which God shows mercy to the 1,000th generation, to those who love me and who keep my mitzvahs. Oseh chesed la'alafim, la'ohavai, u'l'shomrei mitzvosai. And Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael says that those who love me, that's Abraham. As the prophet Yeshaya calls him, Avraham Ohavi, Avraham, my friend. Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, a good Shabbos, a good Chodesh.